The 1950s was truly an amazing time to be alive in the United States of America. Thousands upon thousands of U.S. troops were returning home from World War II and now unifying their efforts behind industrialization and entertainment. America was seeing reforms at a rate that it had never once seen before. In fact, technologies were popping up all over the place, and things that had just been thoughts prior to World War II were now reality. One of these new technologies was the very first hard disk drive to be used in computers. In 1957, IBM released the very first RAM-based computer, while simultaneously releasing the very first hard disk drive computer. Now, this hard disk drive was roughly the size of an industrial printer and only had the storage space of 3.75 megabytes, which is about one song on your Spotify playlist. But it was revolutionary to the computer world. Another technology completely new to the 1950s was that of the rocket. The space race was on, and the Soviet Union was the first to hit home. They launched the Sputnik 1 into outer space in 1957. This just drove Americans to be the next one to put something in outer space, and they did just that by hurling the Explorer 1 into orbit in 1958. And another technology that, although was not new to the 1950s, was widely improved upon in the 1950s, was that of the automobile. The Chevrolet Bel Air, released in 1957, was extremely unique to the 1950s and produced an overall look to a car that the 1950s car had. It had a very sleek jet engine appearance on the upper parts of the car. On the rear, it had protruding tail fins and also protruding backlights that were meant to resemble the afterburners of a fighter jet in World War II. And with the 1953 Interstate Commerce Act, these jet cars now had a sleek new runway to run on, and people were doing just that. The 1950s weren't just about all the new, latest and greatest technologies that people could get their hands on. In fact, entertainment played a vital role in shaping the culture of the 1950s, with many artists such as Elvis Presley producing a new sound strictly unique to the 1950s, known as rock and roll. Music was becoming more and more prevalent. Country also played a massive role in the 1950s music. Artists such as Hank Williams, Johnny Cash, and Elvis Presley himself also played a major role in shaping the country sound. Bluegrass was also extremely prevalent in the 1950s, with artists such as Bill Monroe, Lester Flatt, and Earl Scruggs, and Don Reno and the Boys. Another form of recreation found in the 1950s was that of the television. It grew extremely in popularity in the 1950s, with many shows now portraying the American dream, the getting out into the suburbs around the cities. Shows such as Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver portrayed just that. There was also country and westerns out there, such as The Lone Ranger, Gunsmoke, and The Rifleman. And there were also shows that didn't really portray the American dream or anything like that, such as I Love Lucy. Another show that many of us probably are extremely familiar with is that of Andy Griffith. Now, Andy Griffith wasn't released until 1960, but it was thought of, screencasted, and somewhat filmed in the 1950s, and it was also meant to portray life in the 1950s. So why not use them for the model of fashion of the 1950s? Looking at the typical Andy Griffith character, such as Barney Fife, we can see a very, very common fashion trend in the 1950s. Barney wore pooched out slack pants, button-up shirt, a skinny little tie, and a hat. Andy kept himself a much more contemporary version of the 1950s style, wearing no hat and no skinny little tie, just the pooched out pants and button-up shirt. Women wore mainly skirts and blouses or knee-length dresses, and usually wore some form of jewelry, such as bracelets, necklace, or even a brooch. Or in the case of Aunt Bee, all three. The 1950s was also a booming time both economically and politically. With the GI Bill now passed, many of these returning soldiers now had the means to move out of the noisy, crowded cities into the surrounding suburbs. The Civil Rights Movement was also extremely prevalent in the 1950s, with African Americans now fighting for their rights in cases such as the Brown versus Board of Education and Brown versus Topeka, Kansas. These cases eventually led to the breakdown of de facto and de jure segregation. So there you have it, the 1950s in a nutshell, and I just barely scratched the surface. This was truly an amazing time to be alive as Americans. New technologies and modern conveniences were sweeping the market and being released daily. Americans were experiencing luxury that they had never once felt before.
Now, if you're not familiar with firearms, these babies can go off.
And deputies were just a little too quick to their triggers. How would you have liked to live in the 1950s?